The Focke-Wulf 190 touched down on British soil at precisely 1:45 p.m. Wheels kissed tarmac. The engine's roar faded to a rumble. Oberleutnant Armin Faber killed the ignition and popped the canopy, expecting to see Luftwaffe ground crew rushing toward him. Instead, he saw Spitfires, dozens of them, lined up in perfect rows, RAF roundels gleaming in the June sunlight. His stomach dropped. The mechanics running toward his aircraft weren't wearing German gray, they were wearing enemy blue. In that single horrifying moment of recognition, Faber realized he'd just done the impossible. He'd delivered Germany's most lethal fighter aircraft, completely intact, directly into the hands of British intelligence. No battle damage, no missing parts, full fuel tanks, ammunition loaded. Every secret, every advantage, every technical detail that had been slaughtering Allied pilots for 11 months handed over like a gift. The navigation error that would cost Germany the air war had just happened, and there was no taking it back. June 23, 1942, RAF Pembrey in South Wales, a coastal airfield that had seen its share of action, but nothing particularly dramatic that Tuesday afternoon. Flight Sergeant Jeffries stood in the observation tower, binoculars raised, scanning the summer sky out of habit more than urgency. The morning patrol had returned hours ago, no raids expected. Just another quiet day in a war that had momentarily moved elsewhere. Then he saw it. A single aircraft, inbound from the south, low altitude, descending. Jeffries tracked it through his binoculars, noting the approach angle, the flight characteristics. Something felt wrong. Not threatening, just wrong. The aircraft was too fast, too aggressive in its movements. Not British. Definitely not British. "Sir," he called to the duty officer, "we've got an incoming, single aircraft, unidentified." The duty officer grabbed his own binoculars. They watched together as the aircraft continued its approach. No evasive maneuvers, no combat flying, just a clean, confident approach, like a pilot coming home after a milk run. The silhouette resolved into something they'd seen before, but always at a distance, always in combat. Never like this. Never landing. The duty officer's voice went quiet. "That's a Focke-Wulf." For a moment, neither man moved. The standard procedure was obvious. Sound the alarm, scramble fighters, shoot it down. But the FW-190 was already in its landing pattern. Gear down. Flaps extended, the universal signal of peaceful intent. And more importantly, it was about to hand them something British intelligence had been desperately trying to acquire for almost a year. "Don't shoot," the duty officer said. "Let him land. Get everyone to the runway. Now." The word spread through the airfield like electricity. Ground crews dropped their tools. Pilots sprinted from the mess hall. Everyone who could move converged on the runway to witness something that shouldn't be happening. A Luftwaffe fighter, Germany's best, settling onto British concrete as casually as if it were landing at its home base. Faber's landing was textbook perfect. Smooth touchdown, controlled rollout. He taxied toward what he assumed were friendly positions, his mind already composing the report he'd file about the brief combat over the channel. 3 Spitfires engaged. 1 confirmed kill. Ammunition nearly exhausted. Emergency landing at nearest friendly airfield per standard protocol. He shut down the engine. The silence felt wrong. Too quiet. No familiar sounds of a German airbase. No voices shouting in German. Just an eerie stillness that made his skin prickle, with the first whisper of wrongness. Faber released his harness and stood in the cockpit. That's when his world inverted. The uniforms were wrong. The aircraft were wrong. The faces staring at him from 30 yards away were the faces of the enemy. He'd studied those uniforms in recognition training, RAF blue, not Luftwaffe gray. His hand instinctively moved toward his sidearm, but what was the point? He was surrounded by an entire British airfield. His fighter was already captured. The mistake was already made. Faber's mind raced backward through his flight. The combat over the channel, the disorientation after his kills, the clouds. He'd emerged from cloud cover, assuming he'd drifted east toward France. The coastline below had looked right. The heading had felt correct. But he'd been turned around. The geography of Wales and northern France near Brest looked similar from altitude. Similar coastlines, similar terrain. He'd misread every landmark, every visual cue, made every wrong assumption, and flown north into England when he thought he was flying south into friendly territory. The British soldiers reached his aircraft, rifles raised, voices shouting orders in English. Faber raised his hands and climbed down from the cockpit of what was now the most valuable intelligence prize in the European theater. For 11 months, Allied pilots had been dying to an aircraft they barely understood. The Focke-Wulf 190 had entered service in August 1941, and from its first combat missions, it had dominated the skies over Europe. RAF Spitfire pilots, the men who'd won the Battle of Britain, suddenly found themselves outclassed by a German fighter that seemed to do everything better. It was faster in level flight. It rolled faster than anything the Allies flew. It could dive away from trouble and climb back to altitude before British fighters could pursue. Its armament, 4 machine guns, and 2 20mm cannons could shred a Spitfire in a single burst. Worst of all, it seemed to absorb damage that would destroy other aircraft and keep flying. British pilots filed report after report describing this new German fighter. Intelligence officers compiled the data, trying to build a picture of the enemy's capabilities. But all they had were glimpses. Combat assessments made during desperate maneuvers. Observations of wreckage from crashed aircraft. Blurry reconnaissance photos of FW-190 seconds on the ground. Nothing definitive. Nothing that explained exactly how the Germans had built a fighter that suddenly dominated the air war. The Spitfire Mark V, the RAF's frontline fighter, couldn't match it. British test pilots flew captured German aircraft when they could get them Messerschmitt 109 seconds, mostly, and recommended tactical counters. But the FW-190 was different. It fought differently. It used different tactics. And most frustratingly, the RAF had no intact example to study, no way to discover its weaknesses, no method to develop effective counters. Air Ministry officials and aircraft designers knew they needed to build better fighters. The Spitfire Mark IX was in development. The Hawker Typhoon was entering service. But without understanding exactly what made the FW-190 so lethal, British engineers were designing in the dark, guessing at the solutions to problems they couldn't fully define. Then, Oberleutnant Faber delivered the answer. Within an hour of his landing, the FW-190 was surrounded by armed guards and covered with tarps. No one outside the airfield could know what had just fallen into British hands. By evening, a recovery team from the Royal Aircraft Establishment had arrived to transport the fighter to Farnborough, the secure testing facility where Britain evaluated enemy aircraft. By morning, the FW-190 sat in a hangar, surrounded by engineers, designers, intelligence officers, and test pilots who couldn't quite believe their luck. They photographed everything, measured everything, documented every detail of the aircraft's construction, From its BMW 801 radial engine to its electrical system to the ergonomic layout of its cockpit. The technical intelligence alone was worth 100 combat reports, but the real value would come from flight testing, from putting British pilots in the cockpit and discovering exactly what this aircraft could and couldn't do. Captain Eric Brown, one of the Royal Navy's most experienced test pilots, got the assignment. He'd flown more types of aircraft than almost anyone alive. He'd tested captured German planes before, but the FW-190 was different. From the moment he climbed into the cockpit, he knew this was something special. The first flight report sent shockwaves through the RAF. Brown described an aircraft with performance that exceeded the worst fears of British intelligence. The FW-190's roll rate was extraordinary. It could reverse direction faster than any Allied fighter. Its controls remained responsive at high speed, where Spitfires became increasingly heavy and sluggish. The radial engine provided massive power at low altitude, exactly where most dogfights occurred. But most significantly, Brown identified the weaknesses. The FW-190's performance degraded above 20,000 feet. Its rate of climb couldn't match a properly flown Spitfire. Most crucially, British pilots had been fighting it wrong. They'd been trying to turn with the FW-190, playing to its strengths. Brown's report outlined new tactics. Force the fight to high altitude, avoid turning engagements, use the Spitfire's superior climb rate, never try to outdive an FW-190. The intelligence flowed immediately to operational squadrons. RAF pilots received briefings on exactly what they were facing and exactly how to counter it. For the first time since the FW-190's introduction, British fighters had a roadmap to survival. The FW-190 represented a fundamentally different approach to fighter design. While British and American engineers had obsessed over inline liquid-cooled engines, the elegant Rolls-Royce Merlin, the powerful Packard-built variants, Germany's Kurt tank, had wrapped an entire fighter around a massive BMW 801 radial engine. The choice seemed counterintuitive. Radial engines were bulky, creating massive drag. Everyone knew inline engines were the future of high-speed aviation. Except tank had made it work brilliantly. The BMW 801 produced 2,100 horsepower in a package that proved remarkably reliable and surprisingly aerodynamic. Tank's engineers had designed a tight cowling that minimized drag while providing excellent cooling. The radial configuration meant the engine could absorb battle damage that would destroy an inline engine. Bullets could pass through cylinders without hitting coolant systems or critical components. An FW-190 could limp home with half its cylinders shot out. British engineers studying the captured fighter realized they'd been wrong about radial engines. The performance data didn't lie. At altitudes below 20,000 feet, the FW-190 outperformed everything the Allies flew. The radial engine's power characteristics perfectly matched the altitude bands where most combat occurred. Germany hadn't made a compromise. They'd made a calculated engineering decision that gave them a significant advantage. The FW-190's armament layout revealed another German innovation. 4 MG-17 machine guns in the fuselage, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. 2 MG-151 over 20 cannons mounted in the wing roots. The combination provided devastating firepower with minimal weight penalty and no ammunition feed problems. British fighters typically mounted all weapons in the wings, creating convergence issues and complex ammunition systems. The FW-190's centralized firepower meant every bullet and shell followed the pilot's line of sight. Then there was the flight control system. Kurt Tank had obsessed over pilot workload, designing an aircraft that managed many systems automatically. The propeller pitch, mixture, and boost pressure adjusted automatically as the pilot changed throttle settings. The cowl flaps opened and closed automatically to maintain optimal engine temperature. In combat, where split-second decisions meant survival, the FW-190 pilot could focus entirely on fighting while his aircraft managed its own systems. British designers took notes, lots of notes. The lessons learned from Faber's FW-190 influenced every subsequent British fighter design. The Hawker Tempest incorporated improved roll rates and better high-speed handling. The Spitfires' later marks received stronger ailerons and refined control systems. American designers received the intelligence data too, influencing the development of fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and later variants of the P-51 Mustang. But perhaps the most immediate impact was tactical. Within weeks of the FW-190's capture, RAF squadrons received detailed briefing documents explaining exactly how to fight Germany's super fighter. The documents were classified top secret. They outlined every weakness Captain Brown had discovered, every limitation, every tactical error Luftwaffe pilots made, every method British pilots could use to negate the FW-190's advantages. The intelligence did something else too. It restored confidence. For 11 months, RAF pilots had faced an aircraft that seemed invincible. Morale had suffered. Now, they understood their opponent. They knew it could be beaten. The psychological impact matched the tactical value. The air war over Europe began to shift. British pilots flying the same Spitfire Mark Vs that had been slaughtered by FW-190 suddenly started winning engagements. Not because their aircraft had improved, but because they understood how to fight. They forced combats to high altitude. They used their superior rate of climb. They avoided the FW-190's rolling scissors. They refused to be drawn into the turning fights where the German fighter excelled. German pilots noticed the change immediately. The RAF had learned something. The easy kills disappeared. British formations started using tactics specifically designed to counter the FW-190's strengths. Luftwaffe combat reports began describing encounters where Spitfires fought with unexpected effectiveness, using maneuvers that negated German advantages. They never knew why. The British kept the captured FW-190 secret, testing it extensively, but never allowing word to leak that they possessed an intact example. German intelligence suspected the Allies had captured FW-190 from crash sites and wreckage. But they never knew about Faber's gift. They never knew that every tactical adjustment, every British counter-move, every new RAF fighting technique came from exhaustive testing of a perfectly preserved fighter, delivered by a pilot who thought he was landing in France. Oberleutnant Armin Faber spent the rest of the war in POW camps. British intelligence interrogated him extensively, trying to extract every detail about the FW-190's capabilities, operational procedures, and tactical employment. Faber, bound by military honor and German regulations, provided only name, rank, and serial number. He never knew that his aircraft had already told the British everything they needed to know. Other German pilots heard rumors. Stories circulated through Luftwaffe squadrons about a pilot who'd landed in England by mistake. The details remained vague, Wartime propaganda couldn't be trusted. But the story persisted. A navigation error. An intact FW-190, British hands. Kurt Tank, the FW-190's designer, reportedly exploded in rage when he learned what had happened. Years of careful development, thousands of hours of engineering work, every tactical advantage his fighter provided, compromised by one pilot's navigation mistake. The British now understood his masterpiece completely. Every strength, every weakness, every design choice. The intelligence coup was devastating. The war continued. The FW-190 remained a formidable fighter. German pilots still achieved victories, flying it. But the overwhelming superiority it had enjoyed from August 1941 to June 1942 evaporated. The tactical balance shifted. Allied pilots understood their opponent and adjusted accordingly. The FW-190 became just another enemy fighter, dangerous, respected, but no longer the invincible killer that had terrorized the skies. Germany introduced improved variants, the FW-190D series, with its inline Junkers Jumo engine, the high-altitude Ta-152. Each represented attempts to recapture the advantage. But the Allies had learned the fundamental lessons. They understood German design philosophy. They knew how to counter radial engine fighters. They'd incorporated the intelligence into their own aircraft development. After the war, Faber returned to Germany. He lived quietly, rarely speaking about his wartime service. Fellow Luftwaffe veterans treated him with a mixture of sympathy and contempt. His skill as a pilot was never questioned. His combat record before the incident was solid, but the navigation error haunted him. In a war where every advantage mattered, where thousands of lives hung on technical superiority, he'd handed the enemy their greatest intelligence prize. Historians have debated the impact of Faber's mistake. Some argue it accelerated Allied victory in the air war by months. Others suggest the tactical adjustments would have emerged eventually through combat experience and captured wreckage. But the timing was significant. June 1942 marked a turning point in the air war. Allied fighter production was accelerating. American fighters were arriving in Europe. The FW-190's window of absolute superiority was already closing. What Faber's error did was slam that window shut immediately. Instead of months of continued German air superiority, while Allied pilots slowly learned through bloody experience how to counter the FW-190, the British gained instant, comprehensive understanding. Every RAF pilot received the benefit of systematic test flight analysis, instead of having to learn through trial and fatal error. The captured FW-190 flew at Farnborough for years. British test pilots used it to train new pilots in enemy aircraft recognition and tactics. Engineers studied its construction techniques. Designers examined its innovations. Even after the war ended, the aircraft remained valuable as a reference point, a benchmark of what German engineering had achieved under wartime pressure. The story of Armin Faber and his accidental gift to British intelligence remains one of World War II's most extraordinary incidents. Not because of dramatic heroism or desperate combat, but because of simple human error magnified by the immense stakes of total war. A pilot became disoriented after combat. He misread landmarks. He made wrong assumptions about his position. In peacetime, these mistakes would mean an embarrassing emergency landing and some ribbing from fellow pilots. In war, they meant delivering the enemy a complete understanding of your most advanced weapon system. The incident revealed something about modern warfare that remains relevant. Technology alone doesn't guarantee victory. The FW-190 was a magnificent aircraft, arguably the best fighter in the world when it entered service. But advantages can be fragile. Intelligence can negate superiority. Understanding your opponent's capabilities matters as much as having superior capabilities yourself. British intelligence officers who examined Faber's aircraft understood they'd received a gift that normally required years of espionage, countless reconnaissance missions, bribing of informants, and analysis of fragmentary data. Instead, a confused pilot had delivered the complete package. Every question answered, every mystery solved, every tactical advantage revealed. The incident also demonstrated the importance of individual actions in war. Millions of men fought in World War II. Thousands of aircraft engaged in aerial combat. But one pilot, making one navigation error on one June afternoon, changed the dynamics of the air war. History pivoted on mistakes as often as it pivoted on heroism. For Armin Faber, that realization must have been crushing. He'd been a successful fighter pilot. His skills were never in question. But he would be remembered forever as the man who gave away Germany's secret. Not through cowardice or betrayal, but through a navigation error any pilot could have made. The difference was that his mistake happened at exactly the wrong time with exactly the wrong aircraft. The FW-190 that landed at RAF Pembrey on June 23, 1942, sits today in the Royal Air Force Museum, restored, preserved, a testament to German engineering and British intelligence work. Visitors can walk around it, admiring its compact design, its powerful radial engine, the 4 machine guns, and 2 cannons that made it so lethal. Most don't know the full story. The placard mentions it was captured during the war. Few words about the circumstances. Nothing about the impact on Allied fighter tactics. Nothing about how one pilot's confusion handed Britain the key to countering Germany's most dangerous fighter. But the veterans knew. The pilots who flew against FW-190 seconds before and after June 1942 understood exactly what Faber's mistake had meant. The British test pilots, who wrung out the captured fighter's every capability, who wrote the tactical documents that saved Allied lives, they knew the value of what had landed in Wales that afternoon. And somewhere in Germany, until his death in 1976, Armin Faber knew too. He carried the knowledge of what his navigation error had cost, not just the loss of his aircraft or his freedom, but the intelligence advantage, the tactical surprise, the margin of superiority that might have extended German air dominance for months more. In the calculus of war, where outcomes are measured in lives saved or lost, territory gained or surrendered, battles won or fought to stalemate, Faber's mistake shifted the balance. It didn't end the air war. Germany continued fighting until 1945, but it ended the FW-190's period of unchallenged superiority. It gave Allied pilots the knowledge they needed to survive. And in a war where every advantage mattered, where the side that controlled the skies controlled the battlefield, that knowledge was worth more than gold. One aircraft, one pilot, one navigation error, and the course of the air war changed. That's the power of individual actions in conflict. That's the fragility of technological advantage. That's the story of the day. Germany's most lethal weapon was accidentally delivered to the enemy by a pilot who thought he was going home.